Greetings and welcome. We are in Junior English. We are back with the great American poet Walt Whitman, and I'm with you in your hymnals at page 433. We're going to be looking at Whitman's very little short poem called By the Bivouac's Fitful Flame. Now, before we go into this poem, and obviously we've got to define our vocabulary, what is a bivouac and why should I care? It will have some importance to the poem. I want to talk about Whitman as historian, so I would write this down in my notes as such. Whitman as historian. You can either be working at level 1 or at level 2B. Whitman is a poet who draws, like most artists, who draws on the stuff of his life. By 1855, Whitman is already deciding that he is going to publish his classic Leaves of Grass. In the middle, however, of his life, the event of all events happens. We, of course, are talking about that experience of the American Civil War. The war that's often referred to by Whitman as the War of Succession. To secede means to pull away from. The southern states had decided that they would secede from the Union and become their own country. The northern states, including President Lincoln, said, no, we will not allow for this to happen at all. The southern states say, you can't keep it from happening. If we as a group of states get together and say, we are no longer a part of this thing called America, then we will do what we want. And all of this was for what reason? So that southern states could have autonomy or power over the decision regarding slavery. To run their plantations, to make their living, they needed forced labor, they said. And therefore, they needed the right to own slaves. It is somewhat mind-blowing today to many students that hundreds of thousands, even millions of people died over a fight regarding whether you could own another person or not. Whitman was very influenced by the 4 years of the American Civil War. Very influenced. So in 1861-62, as this war ramps up, Whitman is working in Washington, D.C. The first major battle was the Battle of Bull Run. There were people in the North who thought that the American war, Civil War as it came to be called, that this war would last only a matter of weeks. No kidding. This 4-year war that ended up being the most horrific experience in the history of America, many people thought it would be over in a couple of weeks. Bull Run was outside of Washington, D.C., and the troops met there. Are you ready for this? There are people in the North who have lots of money, who drive their buggies out onto the hill to watch the battle the way you would watch a drive-in movie. No kidding. They actually thought it would just be a matter of minutes and the whole thing would be over, and the South would say, oh, you're right. The South wins the battle at Bull Run. Those rebel troops run over the Northern troops. Whitman will write in his classic Specimen Days about standing in the streets of D.C. as those Union troops start walking back into the city, defeated. There is a lot of speculation that if the rebel troops had on that day decided to attack Washington, D.C., all the way to the presidency's White House, they could have actually ended the war right then and there. That is a subject of huge debate. Whitman watches these men coming back in, stunned that they lost this battle. And all of a sudden, large numbers of people begin to ask, is this worth it? Look at all the people who are wounded. Well, what happens when you're wounded? Well, to explain that, I got to explain how they fought these battles. They shot weapons that required a loading system, where a ball, a metal ball, was carried on a pouch. So you had several of these in your pouch. You also carried in a flask some gunpowder. You would put a piece of cloth inside of the barrel of your rifle along with this metal ball, and you also had to pour some of this gunpowder down into the barrel. Okay? Then you would pull the hammer back and pull the trigger, and the firearm would go off. Because of the nature of the firearm, there was lots and lots of smoke that would happen when you shot this firearm off. How did they fight these battles? My students often think I'm making this up. I'm not. The way they would fight these battles is in large open areas where you would bring out the troops, one side and the other. Because of the nature of the firearm, you had to be relatively close, roughly the distance between these two walls. Out would come rows and rows of shooters. They would aim at each other and fire away. The first row would fire at the first row of the other guys. Then they had to get up, back up, and reload their firearm. Not like guns today, where you can hit over and over and over. This kind of shooting required that you literally filled up your muzzle one more time. You could only use your firearm as a shooting weapon as long as you had bullets. Because the bullets were metal and heavy, you could only carry a few of them with you. Once the bullets ran out, the only thing left for you to fight with was the weapon itself. So on the front of the weapon, they would put a knife about this long, right? A bayonet, it was called. And it was stuck on the front of your gun. Once your firearm could no longer be used as a shooting weapon, it then became a fighting weapon. So both sides would just shoot these metal balls at each other until they all ran out. Then they literally would just run at each other and start fighting with their weapons. Problem. By the time several hundred men have shot off these weapons, the smoke in the air is really cloudy, really dark, smoky. So often you would have the back end of a battle or a fight where you were poking with your bayonet, using a sword if you had one, using the back end of the weapon as a blunt object, but you were often hitting against things you didn't even see. Large numbers of men killed by what we call friendly fire. The disorientation, you have your weapon, you turn, somebody bumps into you to try to save your life, you stick your bayonet into them, and then as the smoke subsides, you realize it's your best friend on your side. The worst thing that could happen in the Civil War was not death. The worst thing that could happen was wounding. Wounding. Because of the nature of these projectiles and the distance, how close you were, lots and lots of men were wounded. Shot in the arm, shot in the leg, shot in the stomach, and they didn't die. They were then brought back to, for your notes at level 1, field hospitals. Field hospitals. Now what are those? Well, these are little tent hospitals that are set up out in the field. Outside of D.C., there were several of these, especially after the first Battle of Bull Run was lost. And men were brought there to have medicine given to them. But here's the problem. Early on especially, lots of the medicine goes away. The morphine, no more. Question: what do you do in the Civil War field hospitals when you have injured limbs? The answer is amputation. Amputation. You cut it off. You simply saw off the body part and then hope that the soldier will survive the next several days. Large numbers of men died in these field hospitals by infection and disease. Whitman visits early on one of these field hospitals. Two things about it he reports in his writing. One, the smell. We are in the summer, and it is hot, and large numbers of men have to have body parts cut off. Those big mounds of those body parts sit in the hot sun and begin to decompose. The smell of these hospitals where tens of thousands of these men are lying, dying. Whitman says the smell you meet long before you see it. The smell, he called it, of rancid death. Now, for those of you that have ever walked past or driven by a dead animal on the side of the road, that's one. And you know the smell. Multiply that by 10,000 and imagine what the smell is like. But he said the second was worse. More than the smell of these hospitals, he said, was the sound of these hospitals. 1,000 or more men screaming in agony, wanting pain relief that will never come, dying, some quickly, some not so quickly. And Whitman said the sound and the smell was abhorrent. So what does he do? Are you ready for this? He spends the next 3 years of his life almost every day visiting these field hospitals. It says something about the man, and I love to point it out, that every day he would spend a huge part of his day going to these field hospitals and then later real hospitals where he sat next to injured soldiers. Are you ready for this? Both for the North as well as for the South. By the end of the war, there were large numbers of rebel troops who also were in these hospitals, and it didn't matter to him whether they were from the North or the South. He would sit and talk with them. He would write letters home for them. He would bring them treats. There are several stories of him bringing ice cream to large numbers of these soldiers who were wounded. He befriended many of them before they would die. He became close with many of them, writing home to their parents, to their wives, to their sisters, saying, I was with your brother when he died. I was with your husband as he expired. Let me tell you what the last things were that he said. There are many who believe that this experience broke Whitman's health. It was almost more than he could bear. Certainly it had an effect on him. Certainly as a writer and as an artist, it had a prodigious effect on him. He published a series of poems that later were included as part of Leaves of Grass, and he called that section Drum Taps. I would write that down. Drum Taps. This section of Leaves of Grass, and I'm hoping that at some point you pick up the whole copy of Leaves of Grass and look at it. This section of Leaves of Grass is his poems that are derived from his experience during the American Civil War, especially his experience with soldiers. He writes, for example, poems about the big mound of amputated limbs. He writes about the smell. He writes about the sounds. He writes about the dead, the tens of thousands of dead that will be left all over battlefields, and often left there for a long period of time, decomposing, because there's nobody to bury the bodies. And Whitman writes about the terrible experiences in the prison camps. There are several terrible prison camps. The South had one major one, Esterville, that's a terrible prison camp. And he writes about these experiences. In many ways, Whitman is the poet of the American Civil War. The war, of course, finally ends after 4 long tragic years, and then hours later, the man who brought the end of the war, President Lincoln, is killed. He's shot while he's watching a performance, a play, an opera. Whitman and the rest of America have to come to terms with the fact that Lincoln has been killed. And in the moment of public grieving, Lincoln will write the great poems that will help America get through the experience of the death of Lincoln. The most famous, "O Captain, My Captain," where he imagines that President Lincoln is the captain of a ship, namely, of course, the ship of state, the country. And it has been out on a long journey and finally makes it back out of the storm into the harbor. And yet Whitman will say, I can't celebrate that the ship has made it into harbor because the captain is dead, lying cold and dead on the deck of the ship. Lincoln is dead. The other and maybe most famous one, and here again, you're just writing these titles down at 3A, titles that later you can read or Google on your own. These are not in your hymnal, but I recommend that you take a look at them. Again, Oh Captain, My Captain, a very brief poem. I highly recommend that you Google it and read it. The other is a longer poem, and it's his tribute poem to Lincoln, When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed is the title. I definitely recommend you write this one down and take a look at it. It's the poem that he writes about Lincoln's long journey from Washington, D.C., out to Illinois, where he will be buried. It's a sad, sad poem. Whitman trying to come to terms with the death of the great President Lincoln. All of that to say the following. On page 433, we're going to look at one of the poems from Drum Taps. Okay? There are many of these poems we could have looked at. Your hymnal, your anthology makers chose one, and it's called By the Bivouac's Fitful Flame. Now this poem will only make sense to you if you understand the information that I just shared with you, namely Whitman as poet of the American Civil War, and if you know what the word bivouac means. So let's look at that word for a moment, write it down, and then we'll just exegete this poem. It's a simple poem once you know what the word bivouac means. Bivouac simply means the tent soldiers stay in when they are out trying to protect themselves in the war. The bivouac, as your footnote will say at the bottom, is often going to be understood as the night guard. Okay? Doesn't have to be nighttime. Bivouac is simply the soldier's encampment or the soldier's tent. Of course, if it's a nighttime bivouac, you got to have a tent, you got to have a flame, you got to have a fire, right? So fitful here will simply mean that the flame is burning, but it's not burning really strong. You can't burn it really bright, right? Because it's possible that the bad guys or the other guys are going to come and get to you, okay? Whitman liked to do this in Drum Taps, where he would imagine himself as a person or a soldier in the actual battle. Now I should point out, Whitman himself never fought in the war. His brother did, but he never did. But he likes to take the persona or the perspective of a soldier. What would that be like sitting there, knowing that right outside the view of your flame, there is darkness and the potentiality of an attacker? What would that be like? Let's look at the poem. By the bivouac's fitful flame, I'm with you on 433. By the bivouac's fitful flame, a procession winding around me, solemn and sweet and slow. But first, I note the tents of the sleeping army, the fields and woods' dim outline, the darkness lit by spots of kindled fire, silence. Like a phantom far or near, an occasional figure moving. The shrubs and trees, as I lift my eyes, they seem to be stealthily watching me. While wind in procession thoughts, oh tender and wondrous thoughts of life and death, of home and the past and loved, and of those that are far away. A solemn and slow procession there, as I sit on the ground by the bivouac's fitful flame. Okay, let's exegete really quickly at level 1. Whitman imagines himself as a soldier sitting at night next to the fire in the middle of wartime. And notice two things are happening for your notes at level 1. Two things at level 1 you want to write down. First of all, notice that he takes in the fact that he thinks he might be being watched. Who is out there? You can't just get out, of course, side of the light of the flame and just start walking out into the darkness. You could be killed, right? He says, I have this strange feeling that I'm being watched. Maybe there's movement. Is it a person? Is it an animal? I don't know. There's a bit of fear there, obviously. Then the second thing he does, as he imagines himself a soldier sitting there, is to imagine what goes through your mind to try and keep yourself awake. For those of you, for example, who try and stay awake in class during a lecture, what would it be like if you're told, you're the guy that has to stay awake at 3 in the morning, and if we get attacked, it's your fault? Ooh, what would that be like? Obviously, you're trying to stay awake, and one of the ways that you try to stay awake is by maybe thinking, notice in the poem, thinking about what? Thoughts, tender, wondrous thoughts. What kind of thoughts? Thoughts about life and death. That makes sense, doesn't it? Thoughts about home and the past and loved and those that are far away. Of course, we think, don't we, about right now, those warriors, those soldiers, males and females, who are serving right now, defending our country in other places. What is it like right now to be a soldier in Afghanistan? What is it like to know that you've got people who you love far, far away, and you're trying to think about them? Reading Whitman's poems about soldiers in war can make us and help us to have an appreciation for those who are going through the experience. Notice he says a solemn, a slow procession there as I sit on the ground. Let's talk really quickly at 2A. What are possible themes, messages here? Well, one obvious theme or message is we have to appreciate the dangers that the soldier will experience, especially during the American Civil War, whereas the war went on and on, both sides, the North and the South, fighting desperately, desperately to win this war. It was a very, very dangerous time. And of course, nighttime then is a hard time for soldiers, isn't it? When everything is silent, but scary. There's all the potentiality of death there. Of course, another possible message here is the message of the sadness of being away from those you love. Wondering if you'll ever be reunited with them. Wondering what's going on. Remember, back in the American Civil War, the only way other than word of mouth that you know anything about the people back home is through writing letters, which of course is going to take a long time. You could get a letter, for example, from 6 months ago or even further ago, where, for example,